Hey everybody, welcome back to Ministry Misfits. We are here today with our executive producer, back since, we haven't had you on since like episode 4 or 5, I think.
Yeah, it's been earlier this summer.
Yeah, it was way before Brandon. And you are now back. And we are here to talk about something that you have taught on for a long, long time. Because, you and I discussed, you actually, and we can celebrate this as well. Maybe we'll put some party music in here at the end. You are going into your 50th year of ministry. And in doing these 50 years, you've been in the local church, which we're going to talk about next week specifically, why the local church matters. You've done a lot of, inner city street ministry through organizations like Young Life and the YMCA. But you have also spent an incredible amount of time teaching and training, which is how you and I met in the first place. And so today we are going to be talking to Dr. Greg Linville, the world's foremost apologist in sports ministry, but also we are going to talk to unfortunately one of the only professors realistically at a doctorate level of sports ministry. We've got some good friends that are also there now as well, but there's not that many sports ministry programs left. That's why if you are interested, you should contact us. We'll hook you up with the Agone Institute and some of our academic partners. But Greg, we are going to talk today about Muscular Christianity, the movement, what it is, what it's not, the good, the bad, the ugly, and ultimately also how hopefully people will be able to get a hold of us and figure out how to do this thing properly. So welcome back to Misfits, which is technically your show also.
Yeah, it's great to be here. And with our new host, Brandon, it's just really great to see what God's doing.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be here as well and have you on board.
So Greg, let's jump right in, because anybody that has taken your classes know that you have a lot of information that you can give us on this topic, but we try and limit ourselves to an hour here. So let's jump right in. Muscular Christianity. Let's just talk about the history of what it actually is, because this is something that's becoming somewhat of a new hot button issue, which is kind of strange because, like you said, you've been teaching on this forever, and very few people have taken notice outside of your students. But now all of a sudden people are starting to take notice, and not necessarily for the right reasons. So let's start out and let's actually define what we're talking about here. The Muscular Christianity era. What is it?
Well, Andrew, you very politely said we're going to keep it to an hour, meaning that you've been with me and know that I can ramble on. So keep me pointed in the right direction. Muscular Christianity came into being in the 1800s. I think that it had its roots in about the 1820s and the late 1820s, when a man by the name of Thomas Arnold in England became the headmaster of a school in England. And it's reversed. When they say public, it means private in America and vice versa. And so he was the not only he filled 3 different roles. Excuse me. He was the headmaster. He oversaw the whole thing. He was a teacher, but he was also then became ordained so that he could deliver the spiritual side of it. And so the roots of that, he was the first of 3 Toms. His student was Thomas Hughes, who many people have read a lot of his books. And Thomas Hughes, 2 of his novels was about a third Tom Brown. And he talked about Tom Brown describing his life in schools, much like he went to with Thomas Arnold. And in some ways, Tom Brown became a living fictional, but yet in his mind, a living example, an expression of all of Thomas Arnold's thinking. And those novels have been read now for well over a century, and PBS has done movies on them, and yet in the midst of all that, that muscular Christianity faded in the early 1900s. It was so much part of the English culture, and then from the English around the world. And I believe that there are four expressions of this. And I think that some of my compatriots, Stuart Weir and Nick Watson, some of these folks from York St. John University, Leeds University in England, I think they share this view that there's different expressions. In my opinion, the four basic expressions, I've defined them as the classical or the UK version, the evangelical or the international version, and then there's a YMCA USA version, and then there's an Olympic French continental European version. And those four expressions all took muscular Christianity in different directions.
Now, Greg, we probably need to clarify real quick here. When we're talking evangelical international, we are not talking evangelical church model. We are talking a method of international evangelism, not necessarily what we recognize as evangelicalism here in the U.S., correct?
There's some overlap, but your distinction is a good one. And so it kind of flows in and out of that. But yeah, defining them, the UK, this was not so much evangelistic as it was character development. And to be a muscular Christian embodied that Greco era of body, mind, and spirit, and you developed all of them together. The YMCA took it and primarily in the USA, and it took that. Some of it was evangelical and evangelistic, but a lot of it was, again, character development. And the belief was that if you got, at that point, the YMCA was only young men. They got the YWCA started so they could deal with women. But they were going to get young men involved in sport so that the young men could develop. They thought they would just develop spiritually without a whole lot of anything else happening other than just being involved in sports. So it became a more secular approach to it. Of course, Pierre de Coubertin, the guy that started the whole modern Olympics, he really took this and he really secularized it, and it became almost a religion to himself. He came onto it because he read the Tom Brown novels of Thomas Hughes, and he really said, this is what we need for the whole world, and we can bring peace to the world. But that evangelical international model is the one that was particularly embodied by people like the Stud brothers, Kynaston, Charles. These guys were all world-class cricketers, and they went, particularly CT Charles went and started missions in China and also in Africa. And the whole idea of what they were trying to do was not only were they embodying everything that it meant to be a follower of Jesus, and so you had that character development, but they used it to reach other people for Jesus. And so that evangelical model that grew out of the classical UK and even some of the YMCA versions, it spread like wildfire around the world. And so lots of people got involved in it, like D.L. Moody, like later on, and one of the last that identified in this, Eric Liddell. And so let me stop there. And other questions or thoughts?
I was going to say, you mentioned specifically like in the early 1900s, potentially around the time of the Great Depression, where everything kind of decline, did all four of those separate movements come to a halt together, or was it in one of the different sections?
I would say that they're all four still going on today. It just doesn't necessarily use the term muscular Christianity.
Right.
Okay.
And Thomas Arnold never used that language about muscular Christianity. It was actually, it came about through Charles Kingsley, that kind of said, he's the one that used that phrase in the early 1900s, and it caught on, maybe late 1800s. I'd have to go back and check, but it caught on, and it was response to what had happened in the church in that day and age. And many people felt like it had gone way overboard and become much more appealing to women. It was much more feminine. And, we talk about these things today, and we have to understand the culture of that day. When it said it was much more feminine, it wasn't necessarily that they thought it was bad. They certainly didn't have a theology that women were bad or to be a woman was bad. But they started to understand that there were certain things about it that was more appealing to women than it was to men. Now, they didn't even live in a day in which they could even envision such a thing as choosing your gender. I mean, this is a completely different era. And so we have to be careful as we talk about these things to help people define what that meant.
And
in
that
that
really,
day and age.
So yeah, that really is why we're talking about this today, is that
Yes.
typically the U.S. YMCA model, which most famously besides the YMCA is also how we got basketball and NCAA football, which, people
Yes.
won't credit the Christians for that, but basketball and what you watch on Saturday and what you watch in the evenings would not be there if it wasn't for the sports ministry movement. But
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, what we actually see now is we have this kind of cycle, like those of you that listen to the CSRM podcast heard Dr. Linville and Dr. Tucker from Australia talking about the cycle of sports ministry and the cycle of ministry within the church. Is we are in this cycle again of where we have the evangelical church, and this time we do actually mean the group evangelical church, has come back, and they are looking at what is going on in our culture, like Dr. Linville was just talking about, as far as what gender looks like, what sexuality looks like, all these different things. And they are looking at what they believe is perpetrating all of this stuff. And now they are looking at the church saying, well, you have gotten too soft. You are becoming too feminine and not hard enough. And so we need a revival of this muscular Christianity. But the wording that they are using, the phrasing they are using, is not what we see Thomas Arnold and Kingsley and everybody talking about in the 1800s. Now we are talking about a muscular Christianity that means we are men, and so we must be men. And in doing that, now, unfortunately, we are starting to see a lot of bad things coming out of it. And now people are trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater and saying, well, all of muscular Christianity is obviously toxic. And so the sports ministry movement needs to go. Children's sports needs to go. Men's discipleship needs to be completely reevaluated. What happened, Greg? You gave us a good an overview. We haven't even gotten to the 1900s, which is where a lot of this stuff really starts taking place. But how did we go from guys like Dwight Moody and the Stud Brothers, who are doing international missions on a large scale, or Eric Liddell, who besides being famous as an Olympian, is famous as a missionary. He gets a movie after him and everything like that, which If you haven't watched Chariots of Fire and think it's an old movie, you won't like it, go watch it anyway because it's awesome. If we could do the music, we would, but we can't because we'll get sued out of our butts. But what happened, even if we just want to talk church-wise, what happened within the church that has allowed for this kind of cycle to recycle to where now we are having to actually talk about this stuff again?
Well, in some ways, we're very similar in the 1920s or in the 2020s to what was happening in the 1920s and the 1880s. And if you go into a couple of the books that have been written about muscular Christianity, and I've written on it too, but not a whole book, it's in some of the books that I've written, they say that muscular Christianity's heyday was from about 1880 to about 1920, maybe 1910. I think it started in the 1820s. It grew and developed. It got named in the late 1800s, and then it went until really Eric Liddell was probably one of the last ones that was actually identified as a muscular Christian. And of course, he won the Olympics in 1924 and passed away in 1945, I believe, just as the war was ending.
Mm-hmm.
So what was happening then and what was happening now is very similar. The muscular Christianity that grew up in the UK was saying men are finding a hard time relating to church. And I think even in the United States in the 1990s, the Promise Keepers movement came about because there was a similar thing that was happening in the American church, and then also a lot to the Western church. The Eastern church and the Southern church is sometimes a little different, but at least the Western church. And when I do seminars on this, that happens with both genders, male and female, I ask them on a continuum, from one end to the other, if this was the term was conversation, where would you put men? Do they talk a lot? Do they converse a lot? Would you be over here if they do, or would they be over here if they didn't? And most of the women and most of the guys there, they kind of move the men just a little bit, maybe towards center, but they're more active. So the other continuum, are they active? No, they're way over on the active. They're under on the conversation part of it. Women, and the women are the ones that say this to me. They say,
I love the fact you put the disclaimer out there that they told you this.
Far enough. Yeah, I mean, your spectrum is only here. The women are way over here. And they talk about, if a church was to say, come Saturday because we're going to have the greatest time ever, because what we're going to do is we're going to get together and talk, who would show up? And everybody in these groups, when I poll them, they say men don't show up at all. And if anybody shows up, it's some women. They're not even saying that women will show up if you say we're just getting together to talk, but they're saying they're the only ones. Now that's women saying this, not me. But they say, now come Saturday because we're going to have this great thing. We're going to get on a fishing boat. We're going to get out there. We're going to, and who would show up? And they'd say probably both would show up, but probably more men would have show up for that. And then they say, but what do the men do on the boat all day? All they do is talk. And so it's not that men don't talk, and it's not that women talk all the time. It's just, generally speaking, men need an activity to bring out the conversation, and women often need the conversation to start the activity. Now, I know that that's not something that's popular these days, but what's happening in today's church, think about it. Everything is verbal in the traditional church. Preaching, teaching, fellowshipping, singing, praying, reading. Everything is verbal. For men who that is not their go-to, they'll tolerate it or maybe even engage in it. Some men like myself are much more verbal. It's not that men can't be verbal, but there's no activity. And so muscular Christianity in the 1880s to 1920s and now 1980s to 2020s, very similar. And so the churches today that have engaged activity, engaged in outreaches and various things that include activity, are much, much more attractive to men and are meeting men's needs. That is different than saying, I am this physical male and I rule and I conquer and I dominate and you've got to listen to me, and that whole thing about men and women's relationships that can get really ugly. That's not what muscular Christianity was ever designed to be. It was just designed to help men become more like Jesus in a manly way.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what we've talked about before, too, of being an effective ministry. It's very, like you said, designated to go and try to tap into kind of the ins and outs of who God created a lot of men to be at their core, which is great. So that kind of takes apart from what I've seen a little bit as far as, all right, with muscular Christianity, they're targeting men, so you're removing 50% of the population there with women. The other thing I've seen a little bit is with race, too, where, all right, you're focusing on white males specifically. What would you say about that, Greg, but also playing into what we talked about, too, as far as that era and as far as what was going on within the communities of why that was maybe sectioned off?
Well, we'll talk about this in a couple different ways. One of the ways is that we have to recognize culture, and is the culture verbal, oral tradition or written tradition? And many of the oral cultures that tend to be more Southern Hemisphere, non-white necessarily, they tend to have more of a culture that is oral and passing down things orally. And what that means is, as long as that oral tradition is being spoken, the ancient history is still alive. If it's not written down and the oral history passes on, then you don't have the same kind of ability to go back and look at things. And unfortunately, that's part of the downside of oral traditions. This is one of the reasons why CSRM and OVP has been so much trying to get people of different cultures, different language groups to actually write these things, so that there is an ongoing both hard copy and digital version. That's why we're doing the videos. That's why we're doing the audios. We're doing all of this so that there is a record of it. So some of it we don't know because it wasn't written down. But what we do know is that when you look at the urban Black church in America, they have almost always had some sort of sport, particularly in America, basketball, in the last 100 and some years, that they've had these guys that get together to do this, and it's part of their tradition. And so what we can get anecdotally, at the very least, and there is some written record of it, but we get it from that expression that we see and has carried on. And there's another interesting part of this too that people are really not aware of, and that is what is called muscular Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And during the whole era of muscular Christianity, the Hebrew culture, the Jewish faith, really embraced very similar things. And early on, Andrew, you mentioned the Chariots of Fire movie, which was Academy Award winner for lots of reasons. phenomenal movie. They had three men that it focused on. One of them was Eric Liddell, a Muscular Christian. The second man was Harold Abrams, who the movie doesn't say this, but he was known as a muscular Jew. Now, he later converted to Christianity, but the whole movie shows that he's running to prove that his faith is as good as any other. Mm-hmm. And he can be this man as a Jew and still be this great man. The third man was Lord Burleigh. In real life, his name was Burleigh. In the movie, it was Lord Lindsay. And he was the only one of the three that was alive when the movie was actually done. The other two had passed away. And he wanted nothing to do with the movie. But the man, the movie's phenomenal from this perspective. It was written by an atheist. It was written about a muscular Christian, a muscular Jew, and a man who wanted nothing to do with any of them. He was an agnostic. And it was funded by a Muslim. The whole movie was funded by a Muslim, Dodi Fayad, that died in the car with Princess Di. He and the dock workers that he worked with, they fund this movie. And so the muscular Jews also had this expression. And so, expression of trying to become who they were. And again, it really didn't have to do with the fact that men are better than women, but more that men need to find their way to faith and a faith journey, whether it was a Christian or a Jew, or nothing at all. And so they had to change Burleigh to Lindsay because Burleigh didn't want anything to do with it. But
same reason we can't actually play the music is, copyrights and legal and everything else. Great. One thing you pointed out here, which this is also a teaser for why people should come and do the Agone Institute with us in general, is, both with the muscular Christians and the muscular Jews, with Harold Abrams as a perfect example, he's running to show people that the Jews are capable of doing everything that everybody else is as well. It was all about showing his faith. And, I had this discussion with some people online a few days ago about why God is not racist by selecting one ethnicity over everybody else in the Old Testament. Because, the Judaism is not just about ethnic heritage. It's about much more about the covenant and the faith heritage, much more than it is about being a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's about following the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And for Abrams, it was about showing people that just because he was Jewish and not Christian did not mean that he did not have a place in society in an athletic arena. And this goes back largely to what even you mentioned it earlier as far as the Greco-Roman model of sport and everything else, of athletics has always been the place to go and honor your God in competition. Yes. But now we still see that within modern sport. It's just that typically the God that we see being honored is money and pride and fame rather than insert religion God here.
Well,
do you think that
right,
go ahead.
No, I correct one thing you said. It was Greco, but not Greco-Roman, because the Roman, and that brings up another idea of what we're talking about today, that the Greco ideal of sport was very influential in the writing of the New Testament. Mm-hmm. That ethic was you become a holistic person. You actually become kind of a disciple. And then the Romans came in and perverted it all. And it was no longer about the high ideals of becoming this virtuous, great person, but it was more what you had said about the money and the fame, and I'm going to crush you I don't care what that does to you, and I've got to conquer. And so there's one part of it with the Greco that is what the New Testament, a lot of the Roman um, sinking down into that pit that became so horrible. A lot of that came a little bit at the end, but after Paul and Peter and those guys were writing, they were still very much influenced by this body, mind, spirit of the Greco, what we call the Hellenistic culture. And so that's where this whole thing started. I don't know if you want to talk at all about, and this, I think, because it leads to this, about what my thoughts are that in terms of muscular Christianity, there are secular expressions of it and there are religious expressions of it.
And that's where we're going, and that's what I was say. We're gonna take a quick break before we get into it, because really we're about to get into the heart of what the dilemma is right now, and a lot of it is what you just talked about. As again, of the we're starting to we started to slowly lose our grasp on the Hellenistic style of competition and muscular Christianity. We're starting to slide back into Roman a little bit, and what that actually means in terms of today here in the U.S. So we're going to take a quick break. Then when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the consequences of all of this stuff. And then we're also going to talk about how your church can actually use this stuff that everybody is so afraid of right now to better impact the people that you're actually trying to reach with it. This episode of the Ministry Misfits podcast and this awesome shirt are brought to you by Courageous Clothing Company. Courageous Clothing Company is a Christian family-owned business that specializes in custom designs that they create, as well as bulk screen printing of your custom designs as well. When you buy from Courageous Clothing Company, you're not just buying an awesome shirt, you also are helping spread the gospel across the world through the missions that they support, such as this here with Ministry Misfits, as well as with their own designs that have Christian-themed messages, sharing the gospel in an awesome and relevant way, or as we say within CSRM and Ministry Misfits, strategically relevant evangelism. Check out their entire line at courageousclothingcompany.com. All right, welcome back. We are still here with Dr. Greg Linville, and when we broke, he had just given us a brief history of what muscular Christianity looks like, starting in the UK in the early 1800s, ending up here in the US in the late 1800s, and then kind of falling off towards the end of World War II, end of World War I, beginning of World War II era type of thing. And now we are getting into a little bit more of why all of this stuff actually matters to the church, because we talked about the fact that the Greco model of athletics was all about religion and honoring the gods, and how the Roman influence is what kind of pushed it more secular. And now Dr. Linville is about to walk us through this happening again in the 1900s a little bit more, as far as the secularized version within the muscular Christian era and movement. So, Dr. Linville, we cut you off to go to commercial, but start walking us back through this. Where do we start seeing the secular slide?
Yeah, it happens really early, and let's quickly recap this muscular Christian era. And I said the roots of it in about 1820, 1840 with Thomas Arnold. He was the headmaster at Rugby School. And Rugby School was not a school where you learned to go play rugby. It was a very prestigious, still is. You can still go there, see all these things at the school. Very prestigious, what we would call a private school in America. And it's where rugby came into being, and therefore the sport took on the name of the school, not vice versa. The movement flourished from 1860 to 1900 with the Studs, with Moody, with folks like John R. Mott, Stagg, the Dean of American Football, Naismith, who invented basketball. These were all men who were trying to figure out what it meant to be a man of faith. Not that women weren't important, but for men, I'm a man. What can I do? And I'm gonna kind of help springboard from where that was in the 1860s and 1900s to say where we are today. There's four versions that men really represented back in that day. And if you start with Christianity and then build off of that, the sportianity was to Coubertin. And this is the knight as an athlete. That's become a man by becoming a knight, but I'm going to become an athlete. Mountianity, John Muir, a naturalist. Go out into the various woods and mountains and find Jesus there. Corporeanity, the corporate world, Carnegie, the knight as industrialist. And then revivality, Billy Sunday, who left the professional baseball and became the knight as priest. And I think that then we come up, and out of that, in the 1920s to 40s, then we come up to Eric Liddell and Harold Abrams that became these muscular Christian and muscular Jew. All right, so with that little bit of a review, we come and we start to see these four expressions of the muscular Christianity. I'm going to stop for a quick second and say that I have been lecturing on this for 3 or 4 decades. And in the 1980s, when I did this, and I would ask a room of 50 people, how many of you have heard of muscular Christianity? 25 to 50% of the room would raise their hand.
It still would be if you asked this room, because it was only 50% in this room that knew.
That's right.
5 years ago, I spoke to about 100 people at a Chautauqua, and I asked the same, and these, you have to understand, Chautauquas are some of the most educated, informed, they're the leaders of the country, of the world. Not one person 5 years ago raised their hand. This last summer, I was back at the same Chautauqua, and we were back up to about 15% that had heard it. It's recycling. So the four expressions I have said are classical UK. This is Thomas Arnold, Thomas Hughes, Thomas Brown. You just become a holistic person, and faith is just part of it. Then that USA model with Sherwood Eddy and what he began to help change in the YMCA, moving it from faith to just character and nothing to do with faith. Of course, to Coubertin and the Olympics, nothing. It becomes its own faith. But then with people like Liddell, it becomes how we can share our faith, not only how we can fulfill our faith, but we can share our faith. And this corresponds to what most people do when they try to integrate their faith and sport. And it's what I call that when they go into this, they go into it, they have a faith, they have a sport, and then as they try to integrate it, they're trying to figure out how do they do this. The first is what I would call sport over faith. Sport over faith. This is a secular expression of muscular Christianity, that they started with faith, but they capitulate their faith and they go completely, whatever the sport says, take performance enhancing drugs, do it. Cheat, do it. Whatever you got to do. And then that would be what I would call an accommodation. I think I said capitulation, but that's an accommodation. But the capitulation is the Olympic model. It's all sport. There's no faith at all. Mm-hmm. None at all. And then there's the what I would call the rejection. And this is what a lot of people did. This would have been what C.T. Studd did, even Moody did to some degree. And they said, there's things about sport that just are ugly, and I can't reconcile. And so they left sport. And groups like Pop Warner Football and even the hot stove baseball and some of these kinds of things that started with sport completely threw sport out. I'm saying they threw faith out completely, and there were others then that threw sport out completely and just left sport altogether. Billy Sunday became one of the greatest evangelists. I don't think people realize he held the stolen base record for decades. He was unbelievable in his sport, but he left it. And then there's that last one that is a redemption of sport, that people are trying to redeem the sport culture. But that's very, very difficult to do, because particularly as you go up, and we call about the progressive intensity levels of competition, from no competition all the way up to professionalism, every level of those 7 steps that you go up through, it becomes more and more difficult to hold on to your faith. And so for Little, who won a gold medal, where he said, I'm going to participate in sport as much as I can, except if it's on the Lord's Day. And people don't realize that he probably gave up 4 or 5 medals in 1924, not just the one that the movie says he gave up, because he gave up the 4 by 100, the 4 by 400. He gave up all of these, and he only raced in 2. He won a bronze medal, beating Harold Abrams in the 200, and then won the 400. And so he is one that tried to have a synthesis. He tried to involve both, integrate both, but he even had here's my line, that I have to choose faith over sport and I have to reject sport. But most people are trying to keep them together and integrate them. But I'm going to give you a couple things here. And that is, when these two things come head to head, and you have to choose whether I'm going to go to my Bible study or to a practice. I have to choose, I'm going to go to a worship service or compete. I have to choose to go with this team or my family. That's the places where it really, really gets tough. And so what this modern day muscular Christianity, I think part of what is trying to occur, what people are trying to experience today, are how can I get back to that Eric Little, that the faith, I never capitulated, I never accommodated, but I don't want to reject my sport either. And I don't want to reject what it means to be a man and have a manly faith in Jesus. And that's what we're struggling with in the midst of all of our culture.
And that's what really, we're going to have the 4 expressions chart up here at this point while we're talking here. And really what we're seeing is, we're going to end this podcast telling you where you can go to get help as far as doing the redeeming and the synthesis. That we're going to get there. But these other 3 sections, the faith over sport, the sport no faith, and the sport over faith, are the 3 that we are seeing the most arguments about right now. And largely because of what you just said, the one that we're going to get to is the hardest one. And so everybody kind of forgets about it in a way when they start going through these kind of different trials. But in addition to the faith over sport, all this other stuff, we also see you can replace sport with a couple other words as well. It's not just faith over sport, it's also faith over culture, it's faith over TV, it's faith over music, all this other stuff. You can also replace all of that unfortunately what we're seeing a lot right now, even in the sport over faith, where faith is not necessarily counted out, but it is now in second place under insert here. The most common right now within evangelical circles is country over faith. You go, which is a very Roman-esque model of, we are doing this for the glory of the empire and for the gods of the empire, rather than we are doing this for God and country, which is the model that, Eric Liddell models within the Olympic sport of, I'm doing this for my God, I'm doing this for my country, but I'm doing this mostly for my God because when I run, I feel his presence, which is the famous quote from the movie. Those are the different things we're seeing. And so because of that, we're getting a lot of weird reactions within the church, and most of them are actually replacing the sport part of these different models with a different word. And so this is how we get into things like what those of you that listen to Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, you should go listen to it. It's a very good documentary podcast that Mike Cosper out of Christianity Today did. But the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill highlights what was going on specifically at Mars Hill, Mark Driscoll's church. There, what we saw was a muscular Christianity where it was no longer we're going to put sport over faith, or we're going to redeem sport, or we're going to redeem the culture. It was, we need to put faith over everything else. And to do that, we have to actually put manliness over our faith, because if we are real men, then our faith comes naturally. And what that produces is places for abuse. It puts in places for toxic masculinity. We also see this, unfortunately, right now going on. This is the argument within a number of different denominations where sex abuse scandals are starting to come out. Why are we not talking about it? Because in order to put faith over those sort of things, we have to protect our pastors. But in doing that, we are actually putting our pastors over our faith. And
let me get to the root of this. In my opinion, you said what happened? Why did Muscular Christianity fade out? Tony Ladd, Jim Matheson wrote a book on Muscular Christianity, and they gave us a rubric that is called the engagement, disengagement, re-engagement. All right, you got it there?
There it is.
And that is brilliant. What does that mean? It means that all of a sudden in the 1800s, people started to have this idea, I can integrate my faith in my sport. I can integrate my faith into my masculinity. And so they had an engagement. But then what happened? There was a disengagement in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it happened because of the inability of the athletes and those involved to reconcile the cheating, the drugs, the deaths, the gambling, all the alcoholism that went along with sport. They couldn't integrate it. They couldn't reconcile it. And so they disengaged from sport. Now, again, this is Ladd and Matheson. And so they then said there was a re-engagement, and we saw this then. It wasn't called Muscular Christianity anymore. It was called sports outreach, or the sports ministry era. And that began in the 1950s or so. Fellowship of Christian Athletes, Athletes in Action, Pro Athletes Organization, Outreach rather. Anything that had an A in its name came in. Hockey Ministry International, all these groups.
What were we again before you guys finally cut it down? Wasn't it the NAACSRMACAC or something like that?
Yeah, it was unwieldy and running everybody a NASCAR. But what happened then was this re-engagement, and both of the original engagement and the re-engagement were both based upon pragmatics. The initial engagement was the pragmatic of I can actually become this manly Christian. I can integrate my faith in sport. The re-engagement happened because the evangelical world, that fourth one of the expressions of muscular Christianity, said pragmatically, we can use sport as a tool to reach people for Jesus. Why was there a disengagement? Because they couldn't reconcile a lot of these theological and ethical issues. Why are we now having a current disengagement with sport and manliness? It's because we again are falling into the trap of not having a proper theology.
Right.
Both engagement periods were based on pragmatics, what works. Both of these disengagement periods are based on the fact of having faulty, very weak theology. This is why we're doing what we're doing with OVP, with OVR, with CSRM. We're trying to build the foundations of theology so that today women don't have to fear muscular Christianity, masculine Christians. They don't have to fear them because the men that are getting the solid theology about what it means to be a man means I can love my wife, I can serve my wife, I can care for my wife, I can care for my daughters, I can care for all women. I need to be for them what Christ was for the church, laying my life down, not asking them to lay their life down, but me laying my life down for them.
And that right there,
when we get the theology wrong, it becomes toxic.
And that all right, what we just talked about there was actually one of the things that I've found so strange over the past 2 or 3 years is that we actually now are starting to see a theology. Well, they're claiming it's a theology. Really, we know it's a heresy. A theology going around and being taught within churches that sacrifice is not something that is biblical or godly. And that the idea of Jesus having surrendered himself to death makes Jesus weak. And we can't have a weak God because then that makes us weak as well. But that's not what we see in Scripture. It's very clear how this all goes down. Death has no authority over Christ. Christ has to give it permission to do its thing. And he gives permission willingly. But when we take out real theology, biblical-based theology, we run through the 3 tiers on here all the time. Before Brandon was allowed to come on, I had to test him on it. We run through this stuff all the time because once that theology breaks and it's no longer Christocentric because we've replaced it with either one of these 3 other categories, once Christ is no longer the center, it no longer can be biblically based. And if it's no longer biblically based, we start getting all of these other outlets. This is why when you hear people blame church attendance dropping because of the fact that youth sports are happening on Sunday. Your church attendance probably was dropping before youth leagues started doing things on Sunday. You just didn't notice because you were focused in on some other aspect.
And that's why I appreciated too why Greg was talking about really the foundation, especially of the church. I think for a lot of, I'm going to say, kids growing up, their foundation is rooted a lot of times in sports where it is 5, sometimes 7 days a week, and you're spending an hour at practice and 2 hours at the games. And so they get rooted in this sport and competition where then sometimes faith comes on later on. So they start with this foundation of sport over faith and what was rooted and taught into them growing up. So it can be sometimes hard to retrain or relearn some of those habits that start off at 4 or 5 years old, that they learn competition and you got to do everything to be sport. And that's just all your time is consumed in. And so then it's hard to kind of rework that a little bit. Not impossible, but.
And it's not, which is part of what Greg is about to walk us through, is that this fourth model, this box that's up in the top left, right? Top left? Yeah, top left. I'm not... Directions and, this sort of thing is just about as good as math for me here. Up here... No, it's backwards. Up here, whatever it is. Yeah, you get the point. It's on the screen. This redemption synthesis model of sport, of we are going to integrate and not separate out. We're going to integrate. They are going to blend together, where we are going to stay Christocentric. We are going to stay biblically based, but we're going to do so in an athletic or a recreation or a fitness style manner, is 100% possible as long as we actually keep our theology straight.
Absolutely.
And so this is where Dr. Linville, you and guys like you, guys that, Todd James, Roger Oswald especially, who we got to get Roger on here at some point. Roger Oswald especially, guys like Brian Mason, Stuart Weir, you guys have all been talking about this stuff for a while. And the thing that most people don't realize when they come to CSRM or come to, organizations like us, like our foundational partners, is that before we even start talking what sports they're going to do, we start talking theology with them. So what actually is the proper response here? How do we get to that redemption level of sport, of we are going to redeem it? What should the church's response to muscular Christianity actually look like?
Well, you indicated already the three-tier paradigm. It's got to start with theological truths. What do we believe? What do we think? How do we envision? And Brandon, to your point about, the churches are these kids are out there and they're on a playing field and they're not in the church anymore, and they want to blame the sport. I want to blame the church. I want to put the back on the church and say, because you as a congregation have not given these kids and their families a quality sports experience and opportunity, they're going outside of the church. And we've had a very major para ministry that has been producing sports leagues for churches for a long time now. And when they went to that model of saying, we're going to join them, so to speak, we're going to start actually doing tournaments on the Lord's Day, this is part of our problem, not the solution. I maintain that if congregations do sport excellently for kids Monday through Saturday, those folks will be there on Sunday morning to worship in a traditional sense. We know we can worship through our sport. And the church just needs to go out and do sport well. And what do I mean by that? I describe it like this. Now, you got to understand, I love summer vacation Bible school. I think it's one of the greatest things the church has ever done. But most congregations' approach to this is they do sports ministry, they do vacation Bible school with a ball, as opposed to doing a soccer league, football league, basketball league with a Bible. There's a difference in mentality. And those young people that have been gifted by God and called by God to be great athletes, we need to see, the church needs to see that we need to enable them, empower them as much as we do anybody that has a gift of music or drama or preaching or teaching. Everyone has different gifts. Everybody was designed differently, and the church needs to help those kids come along. And if we do that, they'll be there Sunday morning. They'll be in youth group on Wednesday night or Sunday night or whatever. But we need to do it.
And this is where, we really, as we wrap up here, we're not just saying, oh, well, if you redeem it, then it's good. No, we've got to redeem it well, which is why we focus in on the theology stuff so much. But what comes out of it when we actually do this well? When we actually go get into biblically based principles out of Christocentric theological truths and then practice the methods that follow. when we do this stuff. We start to...
Andrew, to your point, you were a collegiate baseball player, and a great coach there, Bob Starcher, had a saying: shoddy is shoddy. It doesn't matter if it's Christian or not, it's still shoddy. Do it, and do it well.
Right. And when you do it well, you see the results. Starcher is a perfect example of that with his wins. You know, Crank finally passed him up while I was there, and that took a long time. But, you know, what we see, you know, the arguments against muscular Christianity, toxic masculinity, Christian nationalism, abuse, all these different things, what we actually see when we do sports ministry well within our churches, when we do it relevant, like we talked about at the beginning, when we do it with an evangelistic discipleship mindset of this idea of the Bible, we're doing these camps, but we are doing it from Scripture, not just doing it to do it. It promotes discipleship. It promotes redeeming of competition, which is what we're all talking about. And so now you don't have to feel bad about the fact you're excited that you won or you're bummed that you lost. It allows us to promote this non-toxic masculinity, this biblical manhood that we talked about with Chalmer Williams a while back. It promotes equality for females because they are able to compete. They are able to do these things well themselves. It allows us to promote an actual family unit.
Let me wrap up.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Let me wrap up with one last biblical understanding when it comes to this, because I am concerned. I'm deeply concerned today about how this revival of muscular Christianity is going to be taken and misused, and toxic masculinity is going to come out of it. Nationalism is going to come out of it, unless we get back to something, and that is the Bible. And there's the verse in the Bible that is used in a negative, and it's misinterpreted, and it says that wives are to submit to their husbands. I'm going to give you two things there. First of all, if you jump up a verse or two above that, it says that they're supposed to submit to each other. Okay? And so that verse is taken out of context and only applied to women when it's for both. The second thing I'll tell you is that in the ancient language, the original language of Greek, that word for submit, the best way I can describe it is that when you go to the doctor and you're sitting there on the side of the bed and he takes a little hammer and hits your knee and your foot just kicks out. You can't help it. In fact, if it doesn't, there's a real problem. It's indicating you've got a real neurological problem. And that's the sense of the voice and tense of that word, that when the man does what he's supposed to do, lay his life down for his wife, the woman can't help but submit. It's the little hammer. And so it really comes back on the man, that when a man's doing what he's supposed to be doing, the woman just naturally is following. And not even following, but just reacting. And so this is where we are today, that if people do not get to the bedrock of the biblical theologies about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman, we're going to end up with toxic masculinity and this nationalism that takes us in really negative ways. We've got to get back to being Jesus and being like Jesus, and then the other things naturally come along. I'm done.
And this is how, we can.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, we can close out on this as well, because we talked last week when we talked the essentials of a church, as far as what essential doctrine actually is and how we get it. Part of what we talked about is that the reason we pushed it towards the front was because of some of the conversations that have been happening on my Twitter feed since 2022 started. The first one of these conversations where I was just like, what in the world is going on anymore, was because of the fact that we had a well-known, I'm not going to say it, you can go look on Twitter if you want, because he proudly posts it. There's a widely known evangelical pastor that made the comment about if wives would just submit, and we need to be focusing on submission within our marriages instead of submission to vaccines and government and all of these other things. And so I just kind of twisted the words around a little bit and said, maybe if we didn't focus so much on forcing our spouses to submit to us, then we wouldn't be going and reinterpreting verses on how we are supposed to submit everywhere in our lives. And the response that I received was much more what we were just talking about, this toxic masculinity. Well, Christians don't submit. Christians are not supposed to give up. Christians are not supposed to do this. On the flip side, one of the other conversations I had is there's a woman who is dealing with spiritual abuse, which we're going to talk about in our documentary and things like that, coming out of a church where there's a former or a member of her former church that has been harassing her on Twitter. And so me and a couple other pastors have been trying to back her up a little bit and give her some encouragement. But one of the things last night, I finally went and looked, because this guy's convinced that harassment is the proper response when somebody goes apostate in his mind. I looked up what his pastor, another well-known famous pastor, wrote a bunch of books. I finally went and looked up what the pastor has been preaching as far as how the church is supposed to respond to criticism and slander and persecution. And what the pastor has been teaching is that you're supposed to fight back, stand up, hold on to your faith as a weapon and not as the tool that we use to keep ourselves fighting through it. And so I finally responded, I think I understand now where you're coming from. You are not the one that is fighting here. You have been poorly trained with poor theology and poor eschatology. And so this is the only response you know how. This is why we talk so much about theology mattering. Whether that's in your sports leagues or it's in the pulpit, both of those places need to have strong theology if it's coming out with your church's name on it. Because your members are going to respond to what is being taught. And so, Dr. Linville, we're going to talk about that next week, actually, when we talk about ecclesiology, we talk about the local church. We're glad you came on. If you want to support us, you know the drill. Buy me a coffee or go to csrm.org/donate. You can donate there. In addition to finding my name on the list, you also can find Dr. Linville. You can also support him financially through the same method. All of that money is tax write-off. It also goes to support the entire mission and vision we've got. We are out of time for this one, but Dr. Linville will be back with us next week, and we're going to talk about one of his favorite things beyond just sports ministry, is what the local church is all about. So we will be back next week.
Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Overwhelming Victory Flicks, Overwhelming Victory Radio, and Ministry Misfits Media. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. Our music is provided by Morning Light Music and is titled Rain. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can support Ministry Misfits at anchor.fm/Ministry Misfits or for a FO1c3 credit by going to csrm.org/donate and selecting Andrew Fouts in the campaign menu. To learn more about Overwhelming Victory or to listen to our sister podcast, visit overwhelmingvictory.org.